Thank you, Ross, for that introduction. Thank you to the Goldsmith team for organizing this series and for inviting me. It's an amazing series. I've loved all the speakers and would have loved to come to all those lectures. And thank you, everyone, for being here. As you can see from the title, As you can see from the title, I am going to be speaking on climate crisis, but from a slightly different angle, coming to it from a different angle and a different approach. So my lecture today is in two parts. In the first part, I will say something about the general crisis in modernist knowledge today. In the second part of my lecture, I will speak about the quote for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, a quote that, as Ross has already said, I co-founded with Dutch visual artist Jonas Staal. And the aim of the CICC project was to expand our imaginaries through the medium of art, but to put art on more solid knowledge foundation. By modernist knowledge, I mean a particular mode of thinking and being that emerged as European modernity 500 years ago when a group of European merchants, a section of the aristocracy, and anti-feudal intellectuals came together and established capitalist colonial modernity in the economy and European modernity as a distinctive culture and society. Today, European modernity is what I will call capitalist colonial modernity. The knowledge system spawned by European modernity is no longer able to sustain the conditions necessary for existence of future generations of humans and all creation. The ecological crisis and the migrant crisis are two visible consequences of this crisis that confronts us today. We are at the edge of an existential precipice. Something must change in the way we think about the world. There is really no choice. So for this lecture, I use brain fog as a metaphor for our intellectual lives today. Brain fog is a cognitive condition. It impairs our ability to think clearly, to focus, to concentrate, to remember. Brain fog in society, as in medicine, is caused by a wide range of factors. But we could begin by recognizing that we live in times of cognitive dissonance. Now, I will begin with a statement about cognitive dissonance that may appear banal to some. I hope that it will help to peel the layers of brain fog that has accumulated now nearly for over 500 years. The human species is a concept-dependent species. That's who we are. Human beings must have pre-existing concepts to be able to navigate their way in the world around them. These concepts change, they are modified, they are revised, or discarded altogether. How did these modifications of concepts occur in human societies in the past? I mean, in pre-modern societies. These modifications of pre-existing concepts occurred through work or practice or human labor, call it whatever you like. Human beings need to work to interact with nature, and they need to do this collectively to exist. During doing so, they form relationships with nature and with people, that is, with each other. Thus, human life is interpenetrated with nature and communal life. The interpenetration of nature and community is mediated by work or labor, and that is the basis for human existence. The mediation of labor is also the basis for knowledge and for continual transformations in pre-existing knowledge. This is basics. Some may wonder why I'm restating something so elementary. I do so because we have moved very, very far away from this basic source of knowledge. So far away that we are no longer able to navigate our way around the multiple crises that confronts us today. Now, a common solution is to rush for more information. But if you have noticed, lately especially, we are finding out that the more information we have, the more misinformed we become. We are no longer able to determine what is fake information and what is not. When we are unable to determine how to tell what is or is not fake news, when we are unable to or unwilling to wade into philosophical questions about truth, about reality, about knowledge, ethics, and the bigger questions, we find our confusion theoretically, try to find respectability for our confusion by developing simple theories, post-truth, for example. A whole body of research and writing on post-truth then follows, because once it becomes an academic fashion, then everybody writes about it and it becomes something. But we have not answered the question about the nature of reality or the nature of truth in our times. We have found a theory, though, a new theory. The brain fog has only become thicker. We are able to argue confidently when climate crisis is limited to a small sliver of the problem. How many molecules of carbon can be released in the air? How many fishing quotas can we issue? Or under what circumstances should we allow plastic use? Should people be allowed to pick clams and seaweeds from seashores? So as long as it's a small sliver of the problem, we have the confidence to deal with it. We are all familiar with such regulatory debates. However, when we step back and take an aerial view of the climate crisis, we find that it is riddled with contradictions and conflicts. Let me give an example that many of you will be familiar with. We know that Unite is amongst the largest trade unions in the UK, and Unite was very supportive of Jeremy Corbyn. We also know that Corbyn was opposed to Trident nuclear submarine production. The opposition to manufacture of nuclear submarine was environmental as well as financial, that is social. We know that nuclear radiation causes long-term harm to environment and people. We know its effects when it is used in wars. We have witnessed what happened to people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when nuclear bombs were used. We know what happened to people in New Caledonia or Melanesia when nuclear testing was carried out. Regardless, the question of Trident nuclear submarines threatened to split Unite when it opted to oppose Corbyn on the Trident submarine issue. 10,000 members threatened to walk out of the union if Unite opposed Corbyn on nuclear submarine issue. Why? Because at least 10,000 jobs were directly at stake, and another 30,000 jobs were indirectly estimated would be lost. Eventually, the unions and the state opted to keep the jobs and risk both environment and social spending on health and education. But I want to push the story of Trident a little further. At the time when the Trident nuclear submarine issue broke out, the Sellafield nuclear reprocessing site in Cumbria had already been fined £700,000 by a court for sending radioactive waste to landfill sites. Where there is nuclear production, there will be nuclear waste, presumably. We know this. People in and around the area had complained about cancer clusters, ongoing cancer issues, which were studied from time to time but continue to resurface with regularity. What is the point of building the site and later suing the company? When we know that nuclear material is inherently dangerous to environment and human health, and we have seen the consequences of it. We are asked to have faith in law and in science. Technology will make sure nothing goes wrong this time around. The law will police any wrongdoing. How does the law protect people? After you are harmed, you can sue for compensation. What's the point of compensation after the deed is done? One might ask. Do I want my child to be cancer-free, or do I want compensation after a cancer diagnosis? Again, it was about 10,000 jobs in the Sellafield plant. War may be bad for future generations, but it creates employment for the present generation. If the examples of Sellafield and Trident submarine highlighted dilemmas for people in their everyday lives, at the institutional level, the cognitive dissonance is not qualitatively different. When we speak of climate crisis, what comes to mind for most people is the apocalyptic warnings by climate scientists. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, has numerous special working groups on different aspects of climate crisis. In 2023, more than 230 experts from over 70 countries met to discuss various aspects of climate change. They warned that continued greenhouse gas emissions will lead to increasing global warming, with the best estimate of reaching 1.5 degrees in near term, which will have catastrophic consequences. I mean, glacier melting, sea levels rising, and such, about which we are all very familiar. 1.2 degrees is the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is 3 degrees rise in temperature by 2030. Now, the IPCC report attributes these increases in emission to, and I quote, human activity. It calls, that's the cause. Human activity. But who put the carbon molecules in the atmosphere? The scientists do not ask such questions. Their business is scientific investigations and forecasting. Who does what is not the scientist's business. For the IPCC, the solution is developing policies that support, and I quote, technology, development, diffusion, and transfer, and as well as finance for responses to climate change. Economists love the IPCC solution. Economists don't like apocalyptic forecasts. They love finance, though. The economists do not ask the dreadful question, who put the carbon molecules in the atmosphere? It is a dangerous question. Markets can collapse, factories can shut down, trade can grind to a halt, currencies can lose value. The fears of economists is true, however. All this and more could potentially happen. Instead, the economist suggests there is money to be made in trading emissions. All this, the economists argue that the good guys can trade in their goodness and exchange it with the bad guys. How will this trade between the good and bad emitters influence the sea and the glaciers to behave differently? Are the seas and glaciers even listening? Our knowledge system, and this is my point, is divided and subdivided and subdivided into endless disciplines. Many of us complain about disciplinary silos. We say we want to transcend disciplines. We want to become interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and so on. But we never stop to ask why we have so many disciplines. Some of us do ask, who put the carbon molecules into the atmosphere? But we continue to look for answers within our own disciplinary silos. Marxist environmental sociologist John Bellamy Foster, for example, follows the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Paul Crutzen, who wrote about the Anthropocene. Following Crutzen's science, Bellamy Foster, the sociologist, argues that humanity has become the main driver of rapid changes in the Earth system. Note the same language of humanity. Which humanity? All humanity? Marxists at least cannot dodge such questions under abstract categories like humanity, humankind, etc. In the German ideology, this kind of abstraction is exactly what Marx argued against. Marx says that by substituting man, or in our more gender-sensitive times, humanity, for the realities of the social positions that individuals and groups occupy, philosophers produce, and I quote, abstract image of actual conditions. They produce abstract image of actual conditions that make it possible to, again I quote, transform the whole of history into an evolutionary process of consciousness. So everything is about consciousness, which in contemporary postmodern time translates as words and words and more words. In other words, abstract concepts like humans is the first step to a theoretical orientation that puts consciousness rather than the materiality of life as the driving force of history. And that's Marx's point. In our case, the term humanity in the context of climate crisis conceals an important difference between two classes of humans in the world today. Those human beings who are an economic resource, remember the word we use, human resource, the economic resource alongside nature. So we have economic resource and natural resource. And alongside nature to be used and discarded by colonialism, old and new. And there are other human beings who govern and manage human and natural resources around the world. My point is this: cognitive dissonance creeps in because there are two realities, and both are real, and both are true. However, our knowledge system does not allow us to acknowledge both realities, both types of truths. When it does acknowledge both truths, in this case, harm to environment and employment, harm to climate and to the economy, we are expected to prioritize one truth over another, affirm one truth as superior to the other. We enter the territory of relative truth, which is really, again, escaping the problem. You may have found a nice theory, but have you resolved the problem that we are confronted with? Underlying the relative truth is a deeper question. Do we survive today at the expense of tomorrow? Put food on the table today, knowing our children may develop cancer tomorrow, as people working in Sellafield plant, for example? Or do we save the conditions of life for our children in the future without food on the table today? Do we stop rising sea levels and glacier melts by changing our behavior today? Or do we postpone the crisis by making it more, quote unquote, sustainable policies to avoid economic collapse today? Kick the can into the future, as it were. These are existential issues over which all of us make our own trade-offs between survival today and existence tomorrow. These type of trade-offs between existential conflicts have existed since the dawn of capitalist colonialist modernity. Layers of dissonance, generation after generation, has produced such thick cognitive fog that we sense that we are at an existential crossroad, but our answers go round in circles, similar to the environment or employment, climate or economy dilemmas in the examples that I gave. More importantly, all of us speak of we. But who is the we? But who is the we in a knowledge system where the only possibility is I? And the I is fragmented into multiple disciplines. Is the I in sociology the same as the I in medicine? Are we going to continue debating best trade-offs between multiple existential conflicts? Or are we going to pause and ask, what is the cause of this brain fog? And that is what brings me to the second part of my talk, which is on the climate crisis. The remedy for brain fog I want to propose is to develop new imaginaries. That means going to the root cause of the brain fog, the layering that has happened over many generations. If human beings are concept-dependent beings, as I said at the beginning, and if the concepts that they are currently operating with, which have developed over 500 years, since the dawn of capitalist colonial modernity, and if those concepts have brought nature and people around the world to a precipice, then we cannot return to the same old concepts and same old theories and same old methods for solutions. As Einstein famously said, you cannot find solutions to problems by remaining within the same level of consciousness that produced the problem. If it is true, as I have said at the beginning of this talk, that knowledge of the world is produced during the course of human interactions with nature and community, we have a problem straight away. Intellectual work in capitalist colonial modernities is already disconnected and delinked from nature and communities. None of us work, and none of our knowledge comes from the work that we do with nature, with actual labor. The disciplinary silos we work with today mirror the endless divisions of labor in society between every branch of production, consumption, and exchange. Much of the theoretical work that they produce is already disconnected and delinked from practice, from working with nature and with people. The workers in the oil rig who drill deep into the sea for hydrocarbons is very far removed from knowledge of mining, trading, and uses of those hydrocarbons. That is done by the scientists, the economists, the engineers, who are not the ones who actually face the sea and must deal with how it behaves, what it might or might not do on a given day. When you go into the rig, it's a very different scenario. Yeah? The ecologists, the forest managers, the agronomists are delinked and disconnected from indigenous communities who have always lived in the Amazonian forest and know it intimately. This theory-practice disjuncture is in turn rooted in the division of intellectual and physical labor that characterizes a fundamental division of labor that exists in modernist capitalist societies. Colonialism added a geographical divide to the intellectual manual division of labor. The Amazonian forest, the cotton fields, the oil wells are all somewhere out there in Latin America, Asia, or Africa, and the intellectuals producing the theories and developing new uses for the products have no relationship with those natures or cultures. How then do we, as intellectuals in the global north or capitalist west, understand climate change? How can we know what it means as a lived experience? How can we know and value the knowledge we inherit? Yeah. That raises the question about new imaginaries that can dispel the brain fog on climate change. Now, I will attempt to address this question to the extent it is possible to address it at all by speaking about the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, or the CICC in short. And I will refer to some of the verdicts delivered by the CICC in the 4 cases heard by the court. So now I come to the second part where I talk about the CICC and what is how we try to at least become aware of some of these issues. I can't say anything more than that, and I don't claim anything more than that. The CICC is a performative art project in the form of a court. The CICC is based on my critique of liberalism in my book, What's Wrong with Right? Social Movements, Law, and Liberal Imaginations, that Sue has already referred to. The book was written for activists and activist scholars. It comes out of many years of working with social justice movements in India, in the Asia-Pacific region, in anti-globalization movements, and internationally. I found that everyone in the capitalist West or global North, whatever you want to call it, talked about, and they always talked about doing things that were somewhere out there. You know, social justice action happened in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, everywhere except here. There was nothing to be done in the United Kingdom, in the United States, or EU about the conditions there. What struck me when working with anti-globalization movements was the absolute faith that people in the global North had about their laws and institutions. It was astonishing for someone coming from a colony that was called the jewel in the crown. I began to take seriously what one of the governors of the East India Company, who governed the regions that I come from, which is southern India, said. And Thomas Munro, who was an administrator of East India Company for 30 years and Governor General of the Madras Presidency for the East India Company for 7 years. And he said something that has really stayed with me. And he said that Englishmen are as great fanatics in politics as Mohammedans in religion. They suppose that no country can be saved without English institutions. And this is something that has really, really stayed with me, and something that I still think about. I mean, he was like, 1700, late 18th century, and he was bang on about, and he was an East India Company official, right? Soon after, and what has changed? Okay, and then everywhere global NGOs argued for reform of World Bank, for electoral democracy, for humanizing the international system, for demanding accountability from third world states, for bringing their leaders to justice before the ICC, and so on and so on. Within the anti-globalization movements, these arguments became very contentious. And these arguments then produced two camps. One was called the fix-it camp and the nix-it camp. So, everybody, oh, that guy, don't talk to that guy, he's in the fix-it camp. That's how activism works, and that's how it was. Soon after independence, there was a big division in India about whether to follow the modernist system of education and knowledge, or whether we should chart our own course because we were independent. There were those like J.P.S. Oberoi, for example, who argued that we need to chart our own course, and to do so, we need to understand European knowledge and culture. How did Europe become what it became? And as Oberoi says, you can't just, say everything Eurocentric, bad, etc. Europe took a wrong turn at a certain point in its history. And we need to understand that so that we don't take a wrong turn. And that was his argument, and I'm just summarizing it here. How did Europe become what it became? How did it become a society and a culture that can only live by committing genocide against people and ecocide against nature? He argued that this was an important question for decolonizing knowledge, so that our knowledge and culture does not follow in the footsteps of capitalist colonial modernity. Sadly, that team lost out, and India opted for modernist knowledge and culture. But we inherited the teachings of those dissidents and their legacies as the post-independence generation. In the anti-globalization movements, I found myself asking, what is it about European laws and institutions that muddles our minds so much? What's Wrong with Rights is a critique of liberalism as a philosophy, as a legal system, and as a political theory. Now, what the CICC does is it visualizes the critique. It visualizes, it enacts, performs that critique. And it does so by putting the law on trial. Not this or that bad guys, not this or that, but the law itself is put on trial. So that is kind of the context and the background and the thinking behind the CICC. In order to put the law on trial, we cannot go back to the same legal system that produced the problems of colonialism and capitalism. Just as I said earlier about Einstein, you cannot go back. If you go back to that law, you will get that result. And so, central to which is, of course, the expropriation and exploitation of nature and people. That is at the core of that legal system. We need new ways of imagining climate crimes, not as carbon molecules in the air, but as a rupture, an often violent and forced rupture between humans and nature. That is what climate crimes is about. So we wrote the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act. We said we have to have our own law. If we have to imagine it, you have to get out of the box and think about it in a different way. So we wrote the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act 2021, which became the basis for the court and for a different imaginary. The act redefines climate crimes. And then it redefines climate crimes as necessarily intergenerational crimes. Climate crimes are by very nature intergenerational. And as crimes that necessarily impact humans and non-human lives. So we don't accept the split between environment and people. What affects people affects environment, what affects environment affects people. I will not go into the details here. The court takes all the trappings of a real court. So all the rituals, all the drama, all the theater, which happens in real courts if you've been to one. So we follow all of that, all its performative and formal elements, but flips the content completely. So for example, if you look at this text, it is written exactly like formal statutes are written. But if you look at the content, the formal elements, every statute begins with a definition, but we define it differently. So climate means the conditions necessary for reproduction of every species. And it includes ecological conditions, it includes ecological conditions, social conditions, because we should be able to reproduce conditions of life. That is what climate means. And the crisis we have today, climate crisis, is our inability to reproduce the conditions of life. That was what the Sellafield example was about. That is what the Trident example was about. The CICC is a court where legal persons, that is, states and corporations, are tried as legal persons. This legal personality and the inextricably entwined relationship of states and corporations as legal persons, it is that nexus of states and corporations that forms the foundations of English or Western institutions that Thomas Munro recognized more than a century and a half ago. So this legal personality under the law, natural person, it makes there are two kinds of persons. A natural person, which is like you and me and all of us here, and there is a legal person, which could be Nike, Unilever, Airbus, whatever it is. And we are supposed to be equal in the eyes of law. So if you ask for human rights, well, they will get the human rights, even though they are not human. Yeah? That's how the law is structured. And this is foundational. And it goes back to the East India Company, Elizabeth I. So, and it is this nexus that we think is the crux of the institutional architecture of modernity. And this is an image from the CICC law on trial iteration we had in Seoul. And this was the iteration Extinction Wars on Military-Industrial Complex that we had in Gwangju in 2023. And there is another iteration coming in London in April, but you can find all the archives. It's all archived here, so you don't need to, you can just look up if you are interested. So all this can be. In the first iteration in Amsterdam, Dutch corporations and states were put on trial as co-criminals because they are entwined. You can't separate the two. The corporation cannot exist. The economic corporation cannot exist without the state cannot exist without this. It is a legal fiat that gives the appearance of the two being two different entities. The court produced and delivered verdicts in all the 4 cases that were heard in Amsterdam. Having rewritten the law to help us imagine climate crimes in radically different ways, in the verdicts we attempt to dispel the brain fog that has developed. And by interpreting the acts. And one of the things that weighed with us in this interpretation is to see if we can, through the interpretation of the statute, make kind of resources available to activists, to critical scholars, that they can then use in whatever way that was helpful for them. I'll go over a few examples of how the court interpreted the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act, just to give you a feel for how that interpretation works. Now, an important question for all of us. What does justice mean? Now, in the case of Comrades of the Netherlands versus the State of Netherlands and others, the court interpreted the statute as follows. State-centered courts are established to enforce a regime of rights. Rights create entitlements for right holders. The state determines who is entitled to what and how much. For example, states decide which indigenous people are entitled to land and how much land, and who is entitled to disability benefit and how much. States establish court to decide disputes between the entitlements, about the entitlements that it has apportioned to different social groups under statutes and contracts. The idea of justice in state-centered courts is narrowed down to breaches of statutes and contracts affecting individuals or groups. Now see the contrast between this court and the court that you find outside. The remit of a creation-centered court such as this one, which is the CICC, is cognitively wider. Creation-centered courts are established to recognize the life rhythms and life cycles of creation, and to direct human species to organize their lives consistently with the principles of interdependency, intergenerationality, and regeneration of all creation. Creation does not apportion entitlements to this or that person or group, or to this or that resource or commodity or service. Each creation is endowed with its own properties, its own sensibilities, its own purpose, and its own rhythms of life and regeneration. The idea of justice in a creation-centered court such as this one is also cognitively wider. Justice in a court such as this one is intergenerational in the sense that everything in creation must be able to exist first and foremost, and able to reproduce the conditions of existence for present and future generations. That is how the idea of justice is reimagined in the CICC verdicts. Now, if we speak to indigenous people about their land or the children, I'll go on now to the Unilever case, which was the next case that we did. If we speak with indigenous people about their lands or the children, they will simply say, oh, the colonizers stole their land and children. This language of stealing is very, very common if you talk to people. For example, the stolen generation hearings on Aboriginal children who were taken away from them by Australian state. Most people in the West, at least, take statements of this kind, the kind of statements that indigenous people make about theft, as something analogical. That is, they are not real theft as normally understood by criminal law. In Comrades of the Netherlands versus Unilever and others, the court heard evidence from witnesses in India, Kenya, and Republic of Congo. In Kenya and Congo, Britain, a legal person, used military force, evicted people from their lands, and handed over their land to Unilever, another legal person, and imposed what it called hut tax on the Kenyans. To pay the hut tax, The peasants who had lost their land under military duress were forced to work for Unilever. It was a nice circle. The CICC verdict the CICC verdict goes into the definition of theft in the Dutch Criminal Code, because the trials took place in the Netherlands, as well as the English Theft Act. So it looks at the real definition. How does the Criminal Code define theft? And then the court asks, the question that arises for consideration under the Act is this: can state laws that are used routinely to address theft by natural persons who are citizens of that state be extended to non-natural corporate persons of that state who operate on international planes across state jurisdiction? That is, can they be extended to transnational corporations such as Unilever? Because think about it, pause and think about it. When it comes to human rights, we are equal in the eyes of law. They have property rights, we have property rights. Corporations have right to free speech, we have right to free speech. But when it comes to theft, if you put a gun to my head, or I put a gun to your head, and took your land and gave it away to someone, we would be in prison. But when it comes to criminality, there is no equality in the eyes of law between the natural person, and that's the point, and the corporate person. What the Unilever verdict does is to say, okay, the law says natural and legal persons are equal. They have equal rights to property, free speech, rights to organize, rights to migrate. In other words, all the so-called human rights that natural persons have, the legal persons also have. However, when a natural person, commits a crime, they do the time. Not the same with the corporate person. Legal personality is the most loved institutional mechanism for perpetuating ecological and social crimes against nature and people. Now, the third case was about the ING Group. The ING Group is a financial investment corporation. So from land confiscations, now we are into finance. And it's a financial investment corporation with syndicated investments around the world, and many of it in dirty projects like coal, for example, and many other deforesting and things like that. Because these are investment companies. They just put their money into everything that they can find. In the Comrades of the Netherlands versus ING Group, the court asked, the question that arises for interpretation is this: what exactly is the ING Group buying and selling or trading in when it claims to operate in financial markets and engage in financial transactions as part of a transnational consortium of transnational finance corporations? Buying and selling tables or chairs, shirts or shoes, things we need, is one thing. But what is a trade in financial products? What is the product? The court went on to unpack the meaning of finance and observed as follows. The application of human labor to nature and its produce to create goods and services for their existence is a necessary condition for human life and forms the bedrock of societies. All of us need to make clothes, shoes, whatever. Everything that human beings produce and all the wealth produced by societies becomes possible only by applying human labor to nature around them. In contrast, all finance in capitalist societies, whatever the form of finance takes, involves preemptive claims against future labors and future produce of nature, and therefore the futures of ecologies and communities. By laying claim to future profits from future production of commodities, finance becomes a lien on future wealth that has not yet been produced or brought into existence. Thus, intergenerational consequences are inherent in the very idea of finance. So that is how the court then takes the whole interpretation of that. You can see how the legal concepts in use and their institutionalization embed expropriation of the future. Finance sounds like an innocent word, right? Can we expect the same legal concepts and the same institutions to deliver us from climate crimes or climate crisis? The fourth case dealt with the forever wars that we see around us. That case interpreted the meaning of climate So that was the Airbus case on the meaning of climate crimes. I'm just having a little bit of, excuse me for a minute. Yeah. So in Comrades of the Netherlands versus Airbus, the CICC interpreted the meaning of climate under the Act and observed the Act does not adopt the reductive meaning of climate as understood by scientists. Instead, the definition of climate in the Act is comprehensive and includes everything that is necessary for the reproduction of life of all species. The intergenerational nature of climate is intrinsic to the definition of Section 2.1. The four cases between them covered the modern state and the modern corporations as inextricably entwined institutional foundations of capitalist colonial modernity, as an institution that establishes the legal infrastructure for pillage and plunder of people and nature around the world. The Dutch state established letterbox companies, tax havens, and transformed itself into what the International Monetary Fund calls conduit states for so-called capital flows. Unilever, a corporation that became a global enterprise, could do so only because Britain used military force to confiscate land from Kenyan peasants and turned it over to Unilever. That's how it became a global corporation. The ING Group, a global investment company that claims it has no responsibility for how their finance is used. They say, we only lend money. Yeah? Whether it is used for a coal plant or for a deforestation project, what manufacturers do with its money is their business. And Airbus, the producer of surveillance equipment, stealth bombers, and much else, in case there is resistance to the capital flows, the land confiscation, and the financiers of ecological and social destruction. Airbus hardware is routinely used to police migrants coming to Europe because they have lost their land and livelihood at home to companies like Unilever or ING-type corporations. They were used in Libya and Yemen in the wars that happened there. So those are the four verdicts. So the four verdicts go across the spectrum. The state for establishing the legal infrastructures, land, finance, and war. So that's the thing. Hopefully it gives you an idea of what we mean when we say the project aims to expand imaginaries, to dispel some of the brain fog, at least to some small extent. I want to return to imaginaries. Most people, most of the time, whether artists, academics, or activists, when they think of law, they imagine law as a set of norms, a set of principles, a set of ideas. This way of thinking about the law comes from the separation of intellectual and manual labor that I talked about before. For working people, on the other hand, the cold face of the law is its institutions. The punitive powers of the employer to terminate their employment, the police powers to imprison, the state's power to tax, and of course, colonial and neo-colonial governance that takes law and institutions to another level by developing tools to subjugate entire nations, regime change, economic blockades, we call them sanctions now, but they have existed since colonial times, militarism, and much else. The mediation of legal personality complicates the normative and institutional dimensions. The mediation of legal personality deceives, misleads, and misdirects our desire for justice. We end up either going to the state or going to the corporation. Corporate social responsibility or greater accountability from states and so on. The real challenge for climate justice, the struggle against climate crisis, is this. How can we move from thinking about nature as a thing to nature as a relationship? How can we move from seeing people as a labor force and resource and think of people as simply humans? Can we reestablish our relationship to nature? Can we revive the bond and cement the relationships of people and nature? And what kind of knowledge system do we need to help us make that change? Clearly, the one we have is not working. So I'll stop there. Thank you. You want me to be here?
Let's try over here. So we're going to try and project our voices. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, we'll try and make that work. We're being recorded down here, and what that, as I said before, what that will mean is that I'll need to repeat any questions you ask in order for us to capture it in the recording. Does that sound okay? Fantastic. Okay, that was incredible, Radha. So many big ideas that you presented to us, and I just thought I'd sort of, in a way, maybe while people are sort of formulating their questions, maybe just try and sort of think through the different moves that you've made from kind of identifying the problem with modernist forms of knowledge and the way in which that produces a certain kind of confusion that you call brain fog, and how we get sort of distracted in the generation of concepts rather than, in a way, going to the sort of root of the problem. I thought one of the important points seemed to me around this question of the language for humanity that gets kind of picked up in climate science discourse and then replicated in the notion of the Anthropocene and so on. So this idea of a sort of undifferentiated humanity that's somehow equally responsible for climate crimes and the inherent problems with that. And this seems to have a really important connection to this question of who is the we in these discourses, and in a knowledge system, as you said, that privileges the I. So this idea of the kind of individual that no doubt is connected to the sort of idea of the person, the legal person. And I think there's an important theme here around the way in which we're kind of siloed into different disciplines, and I'd like to pick up a question about that actually. And then in the second half, the way in which you mapped out for us the need for new imaginaries to produce different kinds of solutions. So the kind of problem of the theory-practice disjuncture and the way in which liberalism sort of muddles us in terms of sort of, as you say, sort of tilting at windmills that are not the kind of core problem. Then in terms of the way in which you were talking about the sort of purpose, as it were, of the ICCC, this idea of sort of really getting to grips with definitions in the law of kind of key terms, such as justice, such as natural and legal personhood, the definition of climate in this sort of much more expansive way that moves away from the sort of the molecular, or expands out from the molecular understanding of climate to this much broader understanding of everything that's required for the reproduction of life. And then I think it was also very helpful to hear about the interconnection between these different corporations and the way in which, in a way, they perform these different roles that are kind of mutually supporting of this system of extractivism that is ecocidal. And as you were talking, I was thinking that the law and art are both practices. And I think that idea of practice, I'd like to sort of think about and maybe ask you to say a little bit more about the practice of the CICC and a little bit more perhaps, if you could, about how the CICC has attempted to bridge these silos. Like in terms of, you were talking about activists you go way back with, and how that sort of network of activists have come to inform the CICC, but also working with artists and people in other sort of disciplines outside of the law. And in my own experience, sometimes those conversations, those interdisciplinary conversations and collaborations are some of the most exciting moments, right, where you really have to sort of rethink your own practice and assumptions and so on. But they can also be, I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with historians where I felt like I'm being sort of baffed in the nose or something. So they can be quite hard as well. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about this work, this interdisciplinary work, and what that has raised for you as a sort of set of challenges or questions and so on.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, I don't like discipline, literally or metaphorically. And I think my grandmother, more than anyone, knew that. She never tried to discipline me because she said that would backfire. I don't like disciplines. And because I come from an activist background, I never had to fall into, I came to academia very late. So as they say, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, you know. So I never really fitted into any academia. And then when I gave up practice, I did PhD in geography. So so you know, it's not something that. And when you go out and organize, you know, I used to be a trade union organizer. That's how I started. You don't talk about disciplines there. You talk about what do you want, what do we need to do, and, you know, how do we do it? And then how to keep people together. You know, one of the people I work with used to say, 98% of union organizing is about keeping people together. Once you do that, the rest of it is just follows. So it was those kind of things, and they are not really disciplinary modes of thinking. When you come to academia, then you have to use, and every discipline has its own language. It has its own vocabulary, and we get stuck in that vocabulary. And we get so stuck in that vocabulary that when you go out, you know, to a trade union meeting or somewhere, you are no longer able to communicate with people. And this happens so many times. And those workers say, oh, no, we don't want to, you know, let's not invite an academic. I'm saying this here because we don't understand what they say. And this is a real problem. So I think that if we want to, and this academic specialization, as I said very briefly in my thing, comes from division of labor in society. You know, we find that now before our eyes, so many classical language departments have closed, you know, and instead we have, Asda and Sainsbury trying to offer BA in retail studies, that is what drives this academic thing. Art practices, at one time it was about, you expressing yourself. Jack London, who traveled and wrote his stories, didn't know how to read and write. He had to really, if you look at his biography, he says he used to really had to practice and learn. He learned to write. And you can tell from his stories, But now everything has to be professional. So you can say, I have my art practice, but who are your funders? What are they funding? Can you say something on Palestine? Will you still get funding if you say something on Palestine? And these are real problems, right? And so many artists have lost funding because they could not say something on Palestine or whatever they wanted to. So, to your question of practice, by practice I mean, practice in actual social work, actual labor, working with nature, working with people, which is something that we don't really do. I mean, our disciplines are already removed from that kind of reality. It's all, by virtue of being in the university, we are removed from that. This is why after the Bolshevik Revolution, when they established university, there was in Tashkent, University of Workers and Peasants. Yeah? It was the workers and peasants from around the world who went to those universities, and for the first time, many of them learned to read and write. But what they brought to that university was extraordinary. If you look at Rojava University now in northwestern Syria, where there is, people from the region, it's a war-torn region, they come there. They come with the experience of the world. Now, their understanding of war and peace and defense is very, very different from how we understand it in international relations or international. So, what I mean by, practice is being connected to reality. Being connected to reality. It is not about not coming to university or not studying, but it is about studying in a way that keeps us connected to that reality. And in the academia now, if you want to do that kind of practice, whether in art or in law or whatever, you need to go and find it. When I became a lawyer, I decided to be a public interest lawyer. I did not want to go for, Enron or become Unilever's lawyer. I chose to be because that was a choice. It's not something my profession teaches me to do. And it's the same thing with any of our professions. Do we want to connect to that reality, or do we want to remain within that world that is created for us? I'm not sure if that answers your practice question.
It provides a really good answer to the question of practice, I think. I was kind of curious about how the CICC has played out, but we can talk about that.
The CICC has played out, in reference to the CICC, because this is a hearing where the witnesses are themselves engaged in practice. When an indigenous community from Peru comes and tells the CICC, this is what's going on in Peru, this is what is going on in Bolivia or in Congo. In Congo, when we had the Unilever hearings, for example, one of the witnesses, he was actually being, harassed by the police in the plantation that he was working in Congo, and it was, very tense situation. So it was like, and one of our purpose, and the reason we try to do that is also to put all of us in touch with that reality, because it does make a difference. In Amsterdam, when we had those hearings, for example, people cried. They wept because these were real people telling real stories. It's not something curated in that sense. And that also creates a sense of solidarity. So at one level, it's an art project. At another level, it's also solidarity building, network building, all that comes out of that project. It's also a knowledge project. So, it's not in that sense.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'd like to open it out to questions. So we've got, about 4 questions. So let's start in the middle. There was a question. No? Yeah?
With me?
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. I guess I have a quick comment and a question about the first part of your presentation. And the comment is about the Thomas Monroe quote, and I just wanted to sort of highlight the Islamophobia of it, and just that probably shouldn't be presented without calling attention to it, because I think it's so rampant. And then my question is about how in the first half you're talking about Western capital, and this idea that climate crisis is not in our backyard, that it's over there, it's always somewhere over there in the south. But I'm wondering how the issue of class and immigration works into it, because Western capital, of course, is not undifferentiated, and that people might experience climate crisis differently depending on their class position, but also if they're illegalized migrants, if they are casual workers, also if they're immigrants who are coming from, this idea of Western capital being sort of separate in the way that you described. Maybe could you say a little bit more about that in light of that?
So I'll just repeat that for the point for the recording. So the first part was the point about the quote from Monroe and its Islamophobia and the need to acknowledge the Islamophobia in the quote. And then the second point was about a kind of question about a kind of undifferentiated West and the kind of need to attend to the experiences of and the impacts of climate change on people who are subjugated within the West. Did I do okay? Or was there?
Well, they're just a part of the
Yeah.
Western capital. I mean, they're actually very important, especially illegalized and casualized workers are such an important component of how a Western capitalist economy functions.
Yeah, well, to the Thomas Monroe quote, it's difficult to read things back. He was the East India Company official, and I don't know if that's how they thought, and that's how this was not something that was, said. That's what he wrote, and that's what he said. Should I have made a comment on the Islamophobia? That would be reading history back 250 years ago. And it was, to me, self-evident. I mean, he was a colonial official. That's how. So I don't know if every quote that we make needs to be explained. Perhaps it does. On the other question of the undifferentiated West and whatever, I think that gets into more difficult territory that will require a more expanded kind of thing. But in a nutshell, I'll just say this. Today we have about 85% of the people across the global south working to keep what is called the European standard of living. Now, within the European standard of living, there are many rich and there are many poor, and there are many who are going down, and standards of living are falling, and unemployment, all those things are there. But I think we should not lose perspective of the structural conditions that the world capitalism today operates under. And the reality is that 85% of the people are working for 15% of the world's people. This is rough estimation. And within that, there are a lot of, in the global south, there are a lot of super millionaires. You come to India, there's a lot of, disparity, extremely visible disparity. But the architecture is still, is what it is. And that is why I think right at the beginning, I made very clear that what started as European modernity has now become capitalist colonial modernity. So colonial modernity, whether it happens in the South or here, is not very different. And that the European modernity has now expanded to become a universal, international, or global colonial capitalist modernity. Every statement we can go on, breaking it down, but we also need to have the big picture. And that means compromising on some details.
Okay, thanks. So there's one question there at the back, and then we'll come through to the front for questions. Okay.
Thank you for that. It was a really incredible lecture, and your comments on practice just now I thought were really illuminating. I wanted to ask if you could expand on your definition or your thoughts on brain fog. The only time I've heard it used before is by the writer Mel Chen in relation to thinking about brain fog and partiality thinking as a way of sort of thinking about knowledge as inherently interdependent and sort of as a way of addressing questions of decolonization and racialization. So I was just wondering if you thought of brain fog as not only like a symptom of climate breakdown and social breakdown, but also as possibly a kind of practice or a way of organizing. I don't know if I wanted to invite you into that. Thank you.
Okay, so the question relates to the way in which you understand brain fog and whether it's possible in the way that Mel Chen in Animacies, is that her book Animacies?
Yeah, I think that one.
Talks about brain fog as a condition that might be somehow generative as well. Is that a good summary?
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I use brain fog as a metaphor for our inability to think clearly, to remember. We can only remember one aspect of something, one little fragment of something. We can see the trees, we can't see the forest. And that is where I think we start getting disoriented about. Look at how many times we have a discussion or a debate and it feels like we are going around in circles. Take the rights example, for example. Human rights has not worked. NED has using it as American foreign policy instrument. But then we go and ask for human rights. There is no escaping that language. And there is no escaping that. And this, I say, is because certain modes of thinking and certain structures of thinking has gone on for 500 years. That is why we have become, unable to get out of that. Because it's become so internalized and so naturalized that to think of anything, look at it like this. If in the 16th century or 17th century, somebody said there is no such thing as God, that would have been an absolutely nonsensical thing to say. People was not. But there were people who thought outside of that box. And today you say there is no God, nobody is going to bat an eyelid, right? And I think we are living through a moment like that, where the old is not working. Those ideas are not working. We keep going around in circle. Who should pay the bill? Is compensation enough? And then yet when something happens, we ask for compensation. There should be no displacement. In theory, there should be no immigration. People should not be forced to leave home. If they leave it voluntarily, it's a different thing. But then, we think of immigration as a problem, not the involuntary displacement from their lands as a problem. You ask people, they'll say, oh, we got too many immigrants, immigration is a problem. Some will say we have to be kind to them, some will say we have to send them back. But actually, no, we don't say, but why are people leaving their homes? So, there is this kind of confusion in any issue you touch. We get tangled into this confusion. And for me, that suggests that there is something very fundamentally wrong in our knowledge system. Something is not working.
Okay, thanks. So, Abaya and then Joe.
I'm going to read my question. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really informative. I wanted to ask a term that you used. You said, you mentioned that coloniality as well as academia divided the division of labor, and I'm quite interested in that division of labor, which you mentioned that is embedded in capitalist colonial modernity. My question is, how do you situate 3,000 years of Brahmanical casteist hegemonic division of labor, which always did and continued to work in cahoots with and expanded through 500 years of capitalist colonial modernity, especially when you articulate what is wrong with the rights and climate justice, climate crisis and rainfall in relation with South Asia. Where do you situate Dalit labor, manual labor, who are continue to die in the sewages, and Adivasi knowledge systems who have always worked with ecological kins, but under casteist colonial capitalist regimes, the same ecologies are taken away or stolen for profit.
Okay, so just to summarize, I won't try and say all of that, but the question is about caste and its kind of the way in which it has this much longer history than European colonialism, and how do you take account of that in your thinking about climate crimes?
Okay, that's a bigger question, and it's a question that is very specific to South Asia, because Brahmanism is one of the oldest racist ideologies. Let's be very clear about that. It is racist in its most extreme form and ancient. So that makes it different. But one has to distinguish between pre-modern and modern Brahmanism. Pre-modern Brahmanism had division of labor, as you said, which was based on caste, and there was a complete divide between people who worked, the labor, and the intellectuals, or the Brahmins. And there are many historians who have argued that is one of the reasons why technological developments in South Asia has lagged behind, because the people who work and the people who think are so completely divided. But that's a sociological, anthropological question. Fast forwarding to coloniality, I have always maintained, and I still do, that it is the British-Brahmin alliance that made colonialism possible even. How did Britain, the small island nation, become such a big thing? But the difficulty we have is that because of colonial knowledge about South Asia, and there's a lot written on this, Brahmanism equals India. This is how it has become. It continues in the form of immigration policies. For example, in the 60s and 70s in this country, the people who came were all workers, from your carpenters, your builders, masons, etc. After the 90s, the whole immigration policy changed. If you look at the migration now, there's a very clear caste bias in that. So it's the upper caste people who come because they are the software engineers, they are that. So my point, what am I saying? That yes, Brahminism is an old form, but one must differentiate how it interacted with colonialism and how it is now modernized and features in modern forms. So, it's a question of, but it is very, very inherent in South Asian culture, tradition, society, everything.
Can I just add, I wanted to also say, how does that then, I don't think it's specific, of course it originated, but then when the migration happens, the caste also migrates with its...
Yes. I mean, there are campaigns here. In the Equalities Act, 2009, the Equalities, for example, that's a good example, actually. In Britain introduced the Equalities Act in Parliament. There were, gender, sex, sexuality, all kinds of discrimination. And there was a campaign here in Britain that caste should be included as part of the one of the discriminations. And the government said, oh, we don't have any caste in Britain. And then there were, House of Lords, 3 times they sent the bill back saying, if you don't include caste, then we are not going to pass this bill. Then the government said, yes, we will consider it, but they have not notified it yet. And why have they not notified it? Because all their constituencies are upper caste people. Yeah? So, I mean, this is something in the heart of the British government. And we actually applied for freedom of information requests for the documents, and there was all kinds of things. If you accept caste discrimination under the Equalities Act, then there will be serious problems with India-Britain relations, this, that. The 2019 elections, there were people campaigning and saying, asking the MPs, what is your position on caste? Otherwise, we are not going to vote for you. Labour candidates who were not allowed entry into their own temples in their constituencies. This is in Britain, not somewhere else. And 2009, Equalities Act, 2019 elections. So yes, it is there. This is why I'm saying one needs to differentiate between the form that it takes today, the form that it takes in India, the form that it takes in Britain. This is yeah.
Okay. Yol, did you have a question?
Yeah,
Right.
question. Thank you so much for your talk and joining us here. I'm thinking a lot about, recently in the Guardian there have been articles on these interstate dispute settlements and these kind of abhorrent, non-public, private juridical systems where multinational companies can take states through arbitration to get money from the states if they deny some extractive or agribusiness, etc. And that's usually in a world systems theory like a north-south elite capture. And I'm just wondering about this, there's something quite semantic going on with the language, where we're really getting into the meaning of words, but also trying to generalize words at the same time so we can have a similar conversation. Which is a very, it's this Aufhebung in German, where you put something down to pick up, it's this kind of strange maneuver. And I'm just wondering, also with third world approaches to international law and BRICS, and these kind of global movements that are kind of constantly occurring and fighting back against what we in the West know as our capitalist system. And there's definitely a sort of question here that has to do with law being sort of wielded as a weapon, you know, and its instruments and its tools. And I guess because I'm also clearly researching this and interested in this field, I guess what I'm interested in is to know your kind of personal thoughts and feelings about the role of performance and art and the sort of pompeity of law as an approach within the so-called core.
I will try and sum that up for the microphone, but I'm not sure how well I'll do. But so Yol was talking about the way in which multinational corporations are taking states to courts and to get the right to continue to extract and exploit and so on, and how this opens up certain questions about law as a tool and a weapon, but also the sort of performance of law and the kind of artistry of law, the kind of performance art of law, in a sense.
Yes,
I'm not sure if I'd make
general
things
question,
cleaner.
But it's actually just asking you, your feeling working with the arts and the performances of these things and the kind of distinguishing between, working in the public arbitration versus the...
Okay. As far as the investor-state dispute mechanisms and things go, that is a forum for legal persons only, in the same way as a family court is for natural persons only. Yeah? Only people who have family issues go to that court. Only people who have property issues go to this court. And the legal system is divided in that way. So, for example, there have been many cases before the investor-state dispute forums where NGOs have tried to go and present a brief, and they have been told, no, you are not part of this, right? But the law says you can have different forums for different purposes. And that means that, it comes down to that whole division thing, that you have a number of different forums, and they all talk within, like we do in academia. Each discipline has its own language, its own vocabulary, its own whatever theories, so also with the court system. And those principles don't always match up when it comes to society. So that's the first part of it. On the question of performance thing, and this is, I'm speaking about myself here, right? This is not about a general thing. I was a barrister for a very long time. And I was a public interest lawyer, so I only appeared for unions, I appeared for social movements. And literally, I used to feel, every morning I went to court, got my gown on, got my band, got dressed up for court. And it used to feel, I dressed differently, I spoke differently, I walked differently, because you carry yourself differently. And it used to feel like a different thing altogether. You come out, get the gown out, get your band out, everything, go to a union meeting or an NGO meeting or an environmental group meeting, and you talk differently, completely. So it's like two different worlds. And to me, that was real performance, because there was the barrister Radha, and there was the activist Radha. And these were completely different. And my activist friends knew that. They knew when I wore the gown, then I was a different person, and they allowed me to do whatever I had to do, because that's part of the performance. But with CICC, it was very real. It was not a performance. And this is not only me saying this, but people who came to the court. And I remember there was one person who, who was a jury member, as we call them. And he said, he was an activist in Netherlands, and he had been to many courts taking whatever people to court. And he said that, in those courts, when I used to go there, it was like a theater. And I come here and it feels so real. And this is people's experience. And I have tried, and this is not just that one person, but many people come. And as I said, people wept in some of the hearings because the stories were. And that I'm still thinking about this. Why is it that this is a performance, right? But why does this performance feel real and that reality feels like a performance? I don't know. It's a complex answer. I'm still thinking about it. Could be because truth comes to play, because there we cut up the truth and just focus on this. Okay, did you steal this? And, why you stole it can't be a question. This is how it works. You can't just say, I come from a very poor family. There was actually once a case in Sainsbury in Camden. There was this refugee boy, must be 15 years old, who was very, very hungry. And he couldn't help himself. He ate a sandwich from the bar. And they took him to police, the security. And everybody there, it was such an, thing. But everybody there was doing their job, because the security guy, his job was to see that no one steals. Right? And then the police had to, deal with theft. And he could not say, I was just too hungry. I'm a refugee and I get 2 pounds a day or whatever it is that he gets. So, this is the drama element. That seems much more dramatic to me than what happens. And I think, I don't know. I'm still thinking about that question, why it is that this doesn't feel like a performance, the CICC, whereas the legal practice did seem like a performance.
Sorry, but I just want to follow up. Thank you for that. The reason I'm kind of asking this question is because law, by the power holders, is kind of take it or leave it. We see that very often now.
No, you can't leave it. You can only take it. If you have stolen something, you have stolen something. As they say, and this is why you have common phrases. You do the crime, you do the time. This is what most ordinary people will say about the law. So it is a disciplining mechanism. It is a disciplining mechanism. And it disciplines across the board. Even the investor-state dispute mechanism. The corporations there are disciplined, but for their own purposes. Intercorporation relations and, what they call level playing field and all those kind of things.
Okay, I think we have to draw it to a close now. So I'm sure there are lots of other questions, but maybe we can bring them to the CICC and continue these conversations. Thank you so much, Radha. That's fantastic.
Thank you.